Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 45 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Mike, and that is Gavin. Gavin, how are we doing this week?
Good. I am still in this hotel in the desert, but fortunately, let's see. This coming weekend, I will be getting a long weekend to be able to actually go home for the first time in about a month. It's been I really enjoy this job, but it's just been a lot of stressful factors. Um, like they messed up some of my uh, like some stuff with like my paycheck, which obviously is always incredibly stressful, especially when you're starting a new job.
No. Paychecks? Who cares about the paycheck stuff?
Well, and it's like it's really annoying because I'm not going to dox myself here, but like uh they had two separate um like errors in my address line.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, if my address were like 101
Main Street.
Main Street, yeah, we'll say 101 Main Street, they had it be, I think they would, to make it sort of equivalent, 11 Manny Street. So they
Yes.
skipped a digit in the address number and then misspelled the road name.
I remember hearing about this last week, I believe, after we started recording. And
Yeah,
it's one of those things where you just want to know how both of those could have happened.
right. And it's like
Mistakes happen, but both of those happened at the same time.
the misspelling of the road name makes more sense because they misspelled it into another actual word. So like that one, oh, okay, maybe autocorrect got the better of you. But I even like double checked all of my documents that all my new hire stuff, and it was correct on all of them.
It
So I'm
wasn't your
like, okay,
mistake.
this
Yeah.
was not my mistake,
Yeah.
which made me feel a little better. But the paychecks have since come in, so we're all good.
Wonderful.
And
Now you're rolling in that crazy scientist money.
God, I wish like the amount of money, like for example, Doc Brown in Back to the Future must have is like astronomical. And I wish I had that. I wish I had that mad scientist money. Um, but anyway, moving on to some actual
Me
good
too.
news. We're moving on to the calendar for this
Yeah.
week,
Good news. Oh,
which
all right.
actually has some good
That's not where I
news.
thought you were going.
Yeah, no, the calendar.
Good news in the calendar. All right.
Yeah. So it's not the most related thing to paleontology, but once again, I only have like 7 or 8 days to choose from for the calendar for this week. But this was the most
Mm-hmm.
paleontology adjacent one. Plus, it's good news, something I remember hearing about at the time, but hadn't followed up on. But so, Mike, do you have a year for me?
2015.
Close. So this little snippet is from October 18th. So that would be this past Monday, if you're listening to this the week it comes out. But yeah, so October 18th, 2017. And the headline
Okay.
is Healthy Coral Produces Abundant Offspring. Which
This
is
seems
good
like
news.
good news. All
Yeah.
right.
And
Devil in the
so
details. Let's go.
if you remember back to episode 34 of this podcast, we had our best good friend, Fia Campanino, on to talk to us about reefs. And while she doesn't really do coral reefs, we did talk quite a lot about coral reefs in that episode.
Man, I miss Fia. Fia, I hope you're doing okay.
Yeah. I hope you're doing great, buddy. Anywho, so the calendar reads, examination of coral populations within a Caribbean reef on the island of Curacao?
Curacao?
Maybe.
Okay.
Curacao?
You keep going. I'll see if I can.
Sure. Yeah. Reefs in this Caribbean island indicated that healthy, well-nourished coral communities can produce nearly 200 times more juvenile corals than reefs that have been degraded by pollution or other environmental factors. The study's findings placed an even greater value on the conservation of healthy reefs in order to further aid in repopulating depleted reefs and larger global reef recovery. So there's a little bit of veiled bad news there.
As there always
Because
is.
yeah, as we talked about in the episode about reefs, reefs are really not doing so hot right now, especially coral reefs. And so that's good news that healthy reefs can reproduce very quickly. I think that this article kind of takes this quote unquote article takes the stance that like screw helping preserve the already damaged reefs and help protect the ones that are currently the least damaged because they will be the ones that will be able to reproduce and replace those already damaged reefs, which like I understand the impulse. I granted I am not like a conservation biologist at all, but
It makes some
that
amount
might
of
not.
sense, just on face, even if it might not be the best or the
Mhm.
only way to do it.
Well, and it's what this article doesn't really say is that there's a huge difference between Atlantic reefs and Pacific reefs.
Really? What is that?
So, uh, the Pacific Ocean just in general is much older. The Atlantic Ocean has only been a thing since Pangea started to sort of break up, which, like, granted,
Okay.
geologic time is quite a while ago.
Right.
Um, but the Pacific Ocean, I don't know of. I mean, it wasn't always called the Pacific Ocean, but there's been reefs on sort of the uh, eastern side of Asia and in like the Indian Ocean and all the along all of the islands between Australia and Asia for forever, for a really long time. Uh, but the reefs in the Atlantic are much younger. So if you ever see videos or pictures of like the really bright, vibrant with lots of blues and pinks and reds in the corals, those are Pacific reefs. The reefs in the Atlantic are still
Right.
really amazing, but they're much more of like a golden or sort of a brownish color.
I never would have even guessed that depending on the ocean it is. I had always thought without ever looking into it that just calling the oceans by different names like wasn't actually a thing. There was no difference between the oceans, and this was just something done to like make navigation easier and to segment the world. But like there was no functional difference between the oceans. But
No, there
like it
definitely
sounds like that's
is.
not even close to the truth. And I should be
Well, yeah,
teaching my students that, which to be clear, I never did. But
and granted, as we've talked about, anytime we talk about species or any kind of taxonomy, putting different groups of organisms in buckets to sort of compare them to one another, all of that's arbitrary, and those are just the names that we give things. So like, it's the same
right,
thing's true with different bodies of water, but at the same time, uh, you know, there are lots of different species of fish that you can find in pretty much all of the oceans. Like great white sharks you can find more or less everywhere, but
huh?
especially a lot of smaller not open water species of fish are very localized.
Well, I never knew that.
Yeah,
Good
so
stuff. All
that
right, do we have
that
anything else for
is,
the calendar?
I don't believe so. That'll bring us into our actual topic. And
Which
so
I don't have a clue what
Mike
we're
has
doing
no
here.
idea what we're talking about today. And so I told him before we started recording, last week's episode was pretty dense.
And
I
I
said
thought it
it.
was really well done.
Why, thank
Last
you.
week's episode.
Um, but yeah, so I said at the beginning of last week's episode, talking about evolution. If you have not listened to it yet, please do. Not that you need to know anything about it to understand and enjoy this episode, but I said very early in that episode that was very likely going to be the most like material dense episode that we ever do. Just because evolution's a
Hmm.
really big topic, it's a really important
Certainly
topic that
one
a
of them.
lot of people get wrong.
Hmm.
And so
Right, and
coming
including me.
from
If you
that,
listen to that
yeah.
episode, you'll hear me make, I think, a lot of quite common mistakes, or at least I hope they're quite common.
Mhm.
And it was kind of nice to have some of those dispelled and massaged out.
But sort of following in the dense footsteps of that, I want something relatively light for today. And you, having clicked on this podcast to begin with, have at least seen the title. You might not know what it is yet because we haven't, exactly picked what it's going to say, but Mike has no idea what this is. So, Mike, do you know what a coprolite is?
A coprolite.
Yes.
I feel like I might have heard that word at some point in my life, but
I think
I
we've
have no
mentioned it
idea.
in passing on this podcast.
I no, I don't
It,
know what it is.
so a coprolite.
Should I Google it?
No, I will spoil it right here.
Okay.
A coprolite is a fossilized poop. And
Are we talking about poop today?
we sure are. And literally,
Yes.
the next bullet in my outline says insert many jokes. That's literally what my official notes, quote unquote official notes, say. Insert many
I
jokes.
mean,
So,
there's a story that happened in school this year related to this general topic. If
okay,
anyone's interested.
go ahead.
So this was not me, but there was another teacher that had a kid in class that like something was off with him,
Hmm.
and he like pulls him outside in the hallway. He's like, are you okay? He's like, I need to go to the nurse. He's like, okay, like what's wrong? Is it are you coughing? Is this a COVID thing? And he goes, no. And he did a swear that I will cover up here, but he goes, I crap my pants.
Hmm.
This is this is a high school junior who did this, and then had to be escorted down to the to the nurse's office, which I had not heard that before at the high school level.
Yeah, that's a first one for me as well.
Yes, and this was a general ed student for anybody wondering. This was you know this was not some of these special self-contained areas where that is more common. But yeah, I will be laughing throughout quite a lot of this episode.
As you should, because it's poop. It's funny. Uh, um, so coprolites. Coprolites are a type of trace fossil, which again we've talked about very tangentially on this podcast before. But very, very broadly, there are two different, like, very large categories of fossils. There are body fossils, which are what you think of for fossils. Things like bones, things like, clamshells, anything that is to do with, like, the actual body of an organism. Could even be things like leaves from a plant. Anything that is, like, the organism proper is
Hmm.
a body fossil. A trace fossil, or the technical term is an ichnosfossil, are traces of an organism, not necessarily a specific organism. For example, things like footprints. You might not always know what animal that exactly was, but it is evidence of a past action of an organism. So
Okay.
footprints are probably the most charismatic and most talked about, I guess. Uh, Trace fossil, but also things like burrows. Very, very commonly, you find worm burrows in a lot of the different kinds of rocks in New York that I've uh, been with. You can also find uh, different, like, molds, which is sort of like when sediment will get into, like, a clamshell or something and infill it, and then the shell goes away, but you still have, like, that sand that was made up the inside. So you can even still get some information from that. That's like a weird sort of. I think that's technically a body fossil, but if you called it a trace fossil, people wouldn't quibble with you about that, really.
Okay. It
Um,
sort of straddles that line.
yeah, uh, but obviously, one of the most fun trace fossils is
We're talking about
poop.
poop.
Poop. We're talking about poop, and
So poop
so
fossilizes?
it sure does, although it is exceptionally rare. So
Okay.
a coprolite is more or less pretty straightforward in its definition. Some people who study them kind of argue that, like, if it's still, like, in the intestines, or what were the intestines of the animal, that it counts. Some people argue that it has to have been removed from the body for it to be counted as a coprolite proper. I don't know.
I
It's
assume
poop.
it's
It's
just like
all
a
poop to me,
definition
man.
thing.
Oh
Like
yeah,
if
for
it's in
sure.
the intestines, like it's still useful. Just some people would want to call it a different thing. I assume.
Well, I mean, it's like, okay, do you call the poop in your colon still poop, or, like, you still call those the same thing, whether it's in the toilet or still inside of you? Uh, so again, it's like I did not come across a term specifically for when it was still would have been inside the animal. Uh, so I don't know that it's different, but I saw that some people sometimes exclude that from the definition of coprolite. So um, unless I specifically talk about something inside an organism, I'm referring to poop outside the body.
Noted.
But yeah, like I was saying, uh, coprolites are generally pretty rare, and they're especially rare if you're not including gut contents. And gut contents are kind of their own thing. So by gut contents, I mean things that were actually still in the stomach, so that had not yet become poop. Um, Again, some definitions of coprolite include that, some don't. Um, when I similar thing with like poop still in the animal, if I mean gut contents, I will specify and say gut contents. But if you're not including any of that stuff, coprolites are very, very rare. But obviously, we still have them, or we wouldn't be having this episode.
I mean, I have several questions that I assume you're going to get to, but my first one is just how do they fossilize? What are
So
the conditions needed?
they pretty much fossilize like anything else fossilizes. They need to be buried very quickly after having been, in the case of like an animal, after an animal dies, in order to become a fossil, it needs to get buried really quickly before like a scavenger can come along and, spread out the bones before it can be decomposed and stuff. Uh, it needs to be buried. Coprolites, same thing, because there are lots and lots of animals and even like some plants and, fungi and things that will digest and break down poop. Otherwise, the
Uh
world would just be covered in poop all the time. Uh,
huh.
so it needs to be buried very quickly. Uh, Typically, the best places to find coprolites are places where, at the time, the deuce was dropped. Uh, it was either in like a really cold environment where there's just generally less decomposers living.
Right.
Beetles and things, while they do still live up there, they're like population density is just much lower, so the odds of some kind of like dung beetle or other kind of insect that eats poop finding it is just generally lower. Also, really dry environments. If you're in like a desert and some wind blows and pushes like a sand dune onto some poop, that'll fossilize quite nicely.
So, but all of this has to come like really quick in human time. We're not talking geologic time. It's got to be buried, while it's still warm or close to it.
Well, within a day, probably for sure.
Okay.
Um, yeah,
I
just
just always have
because
to make sure when we say, quick, it has to
right.
be done reasonably quick on this
Mhm.
particular, on this show.
Right.
We need to make sure, what's the time scale we're talking about. So it's going to be quick.
So, like every other fossil, after it's buried, uh, all of the organic material gets sort of replaced with minerals to create a rock. Fossils, with very few exceptions, are rocks. That's why, like a fossilized bone, is much much heavier than say you had a fossilized bison bone. That is much much heavier than like the same bone from just like a modern cow, because it's a literal rock. And so the same thing
Hmm.
happens with coprolites. And so that's generally how they're preserved. Although you can also get them in marine uh, settings where there's a lot of like sediment input, whether that was from like a river, whether that was from uh, maybe it's just like really really deep water. So when the coprolite is pooped, it falls down to the bottom of the ocean, and there's just not a lot of things down there to eat it because it's the bottom of the ocean. And
Right.
then that could get buried in a variety of ways uh, for things like the formation of limestone, all sorts of different like single celled organisms that live in the water. They make their little tiny microscopic shells out of calcium carbonate, similar to how like clams do, and they die and then they sink and they basically become sediment and can bury things that way. Uh,
Right.
so that becomes really important for the discovery of how we realized poop can fossilize, because that was not an obvious thing for quite a while.
Right. I mean, I wouldn't have guessed so.
So we'll circle back to that in a little bit. But coprolites are really, really useful in paleontology because they are a record of behavior, which is really hard to come by in paleontology because it's not like you can just go watch, a dinosaur do something to see how it did it.
Not yet.
Mm, I believe we touched on that a little bit in
Yes.
several episodes.
Every time I imply the existence of time machines, Gavin just shakes his head at me.
Oh, okay. See, I thought you were talking about the Jurassic Park method.
Or that too. Either way.
um, but yeah, so we can't, watch animals do things, which is why things like footprints are really important because it can give us really important clues to like how different animals walked. Because the bones can only tell you so much, you know.
Right.
And bones have muscle scars on them where muscles attached, and based on the muscle scars, you can tell how big the muscle was. Different angles and things that it might have put on the bone. But it's like you can flap your arms while you walk. That doesn't mean that's what you did.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like
it is physically possible to do, but just not the normal. That wouldn't tell you anything about the species, basically.
Right. Or just because something was physiologically possible with an organism, that doesn't mean that like that's what they did on a regular basis.
Right. Okay.
And so you can learn a ton about an animal from its poop. And in fact, this is not actually in my notes, but I just had a flashback to there is an episode of Scrubs.
Which is one of our favorite shows, both of
I
us.
love that show so much. I believe it's the musical episode.
Oh, is that the one with Clay Aiken?
No, that was the
Oh no, that was a sitcom.
episode.
Yes, you're right. That was a sitcom.
There was somebody who had like a brain tumor, and it was affecting her brain in a way that made her see everything as a musical.
Yes. I remember.
Which I don't know if there's actually any medical precedence for, but there's a whole song in that episode about no matter what's wrong with somebody, they always take a fecal sample.
Yes, I can't believe I forgot about this.
I'm pretty sure the song is called Check the Poo. And so if you've got some time after you're done listening to this, look it up on YouTube. I'm sure it's there. Wonderful song. I love that show so much. Anyway, you can learn a lot about an organism from its poop. And generally, you can figure out what an animal eats pretty broadly from its morphology, like its bones, specifically its teeth. The big difference between mastodons and mammoths, even though they're both big, very elephant-like things, they ate different things. And you can tell that by looking at their teeth.
Uh-huh.
But, sometimes you don't really get everything. For example, looking at horse teeth, which I've got a master's degree in. That's exactly what I did for my master's thesis, was looking at several hundred horse teeth. But looking at horse teeth, you would not look at that and say, hey, this thing occasionally snaps up little baby animals and eats them. That's also something you should look up on YouTube if you have not seen it before.
What is this?
Like horses will sometimes, if they're just walking around some like baby chicks, they'll just snap one up.
Really?
Mm-hmm. Horses will do that. Deer will do that. Cows will do that. Their teeth would not tell you that. You would never guess that by looking at the teeth of those animals, but they do.
So, for example, like if dinosaurs did something equivalent, like we just don't know about it because we don't see it anywhere unless they happen to have some fossilized poop.
Exactly.
Oh, okay.
And the only reason that we know horses and deer and cows do that is because we've seen it happen.
We can see it happen.
Like,
but this is what you're talking about. Like, this gives you an idea as to like the behavior of the animal, not just the structure of it.
Yeah, and it's like a sauropod. Wow. The big, long-necked dinosaurs. Mm-hmm. If they every now and then just had, were walking by and there was, a sleeping small herbivorous dinosaur that happened to fit in their mouth, which would be kind of hard because their heads were quite small for being as big as they are. But if they came across a small, defenseless little dinosaur that fit in their mouth completely, I have no doubt in my mind that they probably would have eaten it. We don't know that, we don't know that because, to my knowledge, we don't have a coprolite that has evidence for that. But that if we did find one eventually, that would not surprise me at all.
Mm-hmm.
But unfortunately, it is very, very hard to know which poops belong to which animal. Much like footprints. With footprints, it can be hit or miss. For example, there is a whole subfield of paleontology is so different trace fossils. Because you can't know usually what species made that trace, they're given their own naming scheme. So they have scientific names as well, and a whole naming system, just like naming animals and plants and things. And
Right.
so there is a type of early Triassic, or I guess mid-Triassic, so that'd be roughly 220 or so million years ago,
Mm-hmm.
footprints in Connecticut that you can tell are from a theropod dinosaur, the, a la T-Rex, Velociraptor, and such. It's pretty good sized. It's got 3 toes, as it should, and pretty much, I believe it's the ichnogenus is what that's called instead of just a genus. But the ichnogenus of that one, I believe, is called Growlator, which is also just a really cool name.
What's it called? Growlator?
Growlator,
That's a great name.
right? I believe that in that time and place, we only have evidence for one theropod that could make a footprint of that size. So it's like we're fairly confident who made that, but it's like for things like worm burrows and such, it's like it's just a tube in some
Mm-hmm.
sediment. It's kind of hard to say what made that, you know.
Right.
And so poops are very much in that category as well, because some animals make very signature poops, but other animals don't. Um, for example, if you were to look at rabbit poop and deer poop, both are very small and round. If you were to take like a cluster of rabbit poop and a cluster of deer poop and throw them in a bowl and mix them up, you would not be able to say, okay, this one is clearly from a deer, this one's clearly from a rabbit. And it's like those are two obviously very different animals.
So this poses a clear problem then for,
Hmm.
if we're looking at fossilized poop that we, didn't see get made.
Yeah, for sure. But there are a lot of, even despite that big problem with using coprolites for a lot of things, there are still some really useful things that we can get from them. Although there's one problem that also kind of kept popping up as I was sort of doing some of the research for this episode. And this is word for word what I have in my bullets here.
Right.
As you may have noticed in your own personal experience, even single individuals can produce very different poops from day to day. So that's
I have
not to
another story
say.
actually about school. I have more than one poop
Okay,
story about school this year.
interesting. And it's only
I
October.
This is true. Yes, this is another sophomore too. This is another high school kid, not none of the 7th graders. I don't know why all of a sudden I just thought of it now, but I'm going to tell it because it's not all that related.
Oh, go
But
ahead.
I had a student on I think it was like a Thursday say, Mr. Bryson, I got a problem. I'm like, sure, what do you got? And she's like, well, I'm getting my second shot of the vaccine tomorrow. I'm like, that's
Okay.
good news, thank you very much. And then she was like, but I'm really worried because there's a big like Halloween fest basically at our local fairgrounds.
Okay.
And she's like, yeah, I'm going to this. And once again, I will replace her swear word. I'm going to this big this big Halloween fest the day after on Saturday, and I just think I'm going to crap myself everywhere if I get the shot the day before. And then a decision was made by the teacher in that class, which happened to be me. Do I move on, tell her that's inappropriate, do anything like that? Or do I spend the next like 3 to 5 minutes of class really just unpacking that, that thought process there and try to figure out the appropriate way? I will leave it to the listener to figure out which of those avenues I took.
I'll let that sit for a minute. Uh,
I didn't realize I had this many poop stories.
I know. I'm grateful because there's not a ton of content for this, just because coprolites are a relatively rare thing. They're very fun to
Mhm.
talk about, but there's a ton of studies on them. We're not really going to get too much in the weeds of that. I just wanted to talk about poop for an hour. Uh, um, but yeah, so there's a lot of overlap in the poops of animals that eat really similar things. Uh, for example, in the time that I studied for a master's thesis, the early late Miocene, around 10 or so million years ago,
Okay.
in North America, at the same time, there were grasslands all over the place. Most things living in those environments ate grass. So if you were to find a coprolite from that time, it would be extremely hard to tell whether it was from a horse or a camel.
So does that make it useless if we can't figure it out, or even if we don't know what species it came from, it can still, help us out?
It can definitely still help you out for a couple of different reasons. Um, but it's really important to sort of think about like uh, how again I'm gonna continue sowing this seed of working with poop is hard for a lot of reasons. Obviously, I'm sure it's also very fun, but sort of horses and camels, animals that aren't that closely related or that similar, other than if they're in this time and place, they're both eating grass. Their poops look very similar. And horses, but besides domestic horses, where there are wild types of horses, zebras, donkeys, I don't believe they overlap that much with camels. So it's like if you were to find a modern poop, or I guess, in a couple million years' time, if you were to find a coprolite from around today in a particular area, you'd probably be able to figure it out. Or at least like this was from one of this, if it was from like Central Africa, there's not really any camels there besides ones introduced by humans, if there are any. You'd be able to figure out, okay, this is from one of the different types of zebra, or potentially like an African wild ass, some kind of horse. Whereas if you were in a couple places in maybe like South America, where there are llamas and alpacas, which are camels, or at least in the same family as camels, you'd be able to say, okay, here are camel poops, because there are no native horses there. So
Hmm.
time works into this as well, and can be helpful in figuring out what a coprolite belongs to. Whereas, again, mammoths and mastodons, two animals that most people see and they're like, oh, they're pretty much the same. They eat really different things. Mammoths eat grass and therefore have very grassy poops. Mastodons ate leaves and twigs and things, and have very twiggy poops, and you can tell their coprolites
That sounds like it
apart.
hurts.
We'll get there. Um, but yeah, you can tell their coprolites apart much easier than you can uh, certain other things that are not nearly as closely related as mastodons and mammoths are. So
Hmm.
it's a weird case in paleontology where knowing what one particular species poops look like doesn't necessarily help you figure out what the poops of another one looks like, even ones that are closely related.
So it really is species specific.
Yes and no. Like I said, sometimes, like the horses and the camels,
Hmm.
not very closely
Okay.
related, but their poops are real similar. So it's just you have to be really careful, and you have to be very upfront about, like, we don't know what made this,
Hmm.
but that doesn't mean that there's no information that you can get from it.
Okay.
So let's actually talk about some of the information you can get from these, because it's not just for the amusement of paleontologists.
Right.
So it can be really useful studying coprolites for studying differences in diet across the same species in different places, especially in relatively recent geologic time. I'm thinking like Pleistocene mostly. So in the last, 2.5 million years or so. And another example would be mastodons. There's a particular mastodon coprolite locality where they're very common in this one particular area in Florida, where it's like, we know these are mastodons because they're real big. Mastodons are big animals. and
Yes, they
very
were.
they're very twiggy, and so we know it's not like a mammoth. Uh, so it's like they know that these are mastodon coprolites, and if you look at the differences from, I believe they found some mastodon coprolites in Nova Scotia, I believe, so up in Canada, comparing the different compositions of ones in Florida versus one in Nova Scotia, even across the same species, can give you a sense of like the range of food that this animal would eat, because some animals are very like prey specific, and I mean prey in the sense that like what it eats, regardless if it's an herbivore. If it's an herbivore, its prey is plants. Uh, so yeah, it can give you sort of more of a range of what this animal could actually eat. So that's just generally really good information to have. But one of the more useful things that I think you can get from coprolites a lot is particularly from herbivore coprolites. They're generally the most studied, just because they're really reliant on the plants, and the plants can tell you a lot of things about local climate. So coprolites can be used to study what the climate was like in the absence of other clues.
So it's possible that coprolites can be used in addition to for whatever species made that poop, but also just as a general, even if we're not 100% sure what the species is, we know it was left here, and we know that whoever made it was probably eating something not too
Mm-hmm.
far away,
Yeah,
and so we can get a better sense as to just what was what was around that area.
yeah, for sure. Like a lot of times, so I will say a lot of our knowledge of coprolites is mostly post dinosaurs. Um, which is actually really useful, because so fruiting plants, angiosperms, I guess flowering plants is the technical term, but they all produce fruits. Um, they only show up in like I guess they only become common in the late Cretaceous, 70 to 66 or so million years ago.
Uh-huh.
And so there really weren't a ton of dinosaurs that like ate fruit, but you can tell fruit apart quite easily from their seeds. The whole point of fruit is to be eaten, to help disperse seeds. And so by looking at different seeds and things in coprolites, you can tell, okay, this kind of plant was here. And by saying this kind of plant was here, that tells you things about the climate, potentially how much rainfall it was getting, temperatures, things like that. And you can also do things like isotope analyses to help provide some actual chemical, like more concrete, quantitative numbers to those kinds of things as well.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think we've talked about a couple of times before on the show that plant fossils and animal fossils don't tend to preserve in the same places. Uh,
Right. The conditions need to be different, right?
right. So coprolites can sort of serve as a plant substitute in some ways.
Right. Okay. But again, you said even coprolites, like they don't form fossils all that often either. So
Right. Yeah.
it seems like a real crapshoot. Pardon the pun,
Oh
that
my,
was
oh my
intentional, but I
god. Oh
I
my
didn't even
god.
mean to do that, but I
I
don't
don't
regret a
believe
word.
you for a second.
I don't have any credibility on that, but as it was coming out of my mouth, I was like, "Oh, that's perfect."
um, but yeah, so it I think that's one of the most useful things about coprolites, is that they can sort of serve as a plant substitute in the absence of plant fossils.
Right.
Um, so that is broadly how coprolites are most often used. Um, in some examples, though, so we've talked a lot so far about how it is very hard to be certain what animal coprolite was from. But I want to talk about one example where it's like it's really easy to be positive what made this. um, so the largest carnivorous coprolite that I believe exists, or that has at least been like published on, was found in South Dakota, actually,
Of course.
and
Former home of podcast host Gavin Davidson.
sure was. And so it was. I wanna make sure I get this right because it's absolutely gigantic. Um, it even has a name. So this is Barnum the Coprolite, and I want
But
to, like I
wait,
said,
the Coprolite has a name?
oh yeah, the Coprolite has a specific name. Its
Oh
name is
yeah.
Barnum. So this is a Coprolite that is 26.5 inches long by 6.2 inches around, like in diameter.
Oh man, that's a deuce.
That is a gigantic poop. And so it was found in the late Cretaceous Hell Creek Formation. It is full of partially digested bone fragments and some very
So we
clear,
got a
like, sort
carnivore
of
here.
bite marks. Yes. And
Okay.
so it's pretty much like, okay, there's really only one animal in that environment that could even possibly produce a poop that big. And no, it's a T-Rex poop.
Is it? Oh, okay. I was gonna say like an elephant or something, but yes, we have T
Yeah,
Rex poop.
yeah. So it's the largest carnivorous coprolite ever found, and it is named after Barnum Brown, who was the scientist who named T-Rex back in, I believe, 1902. I think maybe 1906.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, so the people who own this specimen, it is actually, and it's a wonderful. Actually, I'm not going to speak too highly of it because I don't actually know anything about it. But you can go to their website. It's called the Pooseum. It
Yes.
is
Yes.
so you can look up Poo, so Poo, and then Zeum with a Z, so like Poo Museum, and it's a nice pun there. Uh, so their slogan is number one for fossilized number two. So it is a museum that
Just chef's kiss all the way around.
mm-hmm, that specializes in coprolites. I believe that they're located in Orlando, Florida. Uh,
Hmm.
yes, because on their website it says they are Orlando's number two attraction.
There it is. There it is.
And so again, I don't know anything about like the ethics of this place. I'm not gonna like vouch for them, other than that they have this specimen.
Other than the marketing is just outstanding.
Yes, they also do have many. It's actually a pretty good resource for finding papers about coprolites. They have links and things to PDFs of different papers about coprolites and different, even like popular news articles. So if you want to read the sciencey stuff about them, you can. If you want to just read the for general consumption articles, they have a very good selection about them. So, but yeah, so they own this T Rex coprolite, and it's like over 2 feet long and over 6 inches in diameter. So there are particular cases where you can be very confident about what animal made that poop.
6 inches in diameter.
Yes.
I mean, there's a lot of jokes to be made there. You already know what I would say, so
Oh my
there's no
God,
reason
Mike.
for me to continue going with it. But that's a giant deuce.
Absolutely. And so I don't know off the top of my head what the largest coprolite in general is. Um, Obviously, T Rex is not the largest animal ever.
What about
I
like marine animals? Do we get anything from whales or anything? Do they just not even poop?
No, whales definitely poop. Everything poops.
Okay. So
Um,
do we get coprolites, from marine animals then?
we sure do, and that sort of is an excellent transition into a
Ew.
little a
I don't
little
even know what
bit
I'm talking
of.
about today, and I'm still
I
doing
know you're
transitions.
you're on a roll, man. Uh, so that leads us really nicely into a bit of the history of coprolites. So, like I said, it was kind of like a mind blowing moment for people to be like, poop can can fossilize, because like even when you learn about it like in school, it's like wait, really? And it's like, I guess, but it's something that even like scientists, until you're taught that, kind of don't think about.
Right.
So in 1824, so we're stepping back quite a bit. This was well before paleontology really got its start.
John
Um,
Quincy Adams is president.
yeah. So
You
I sure I don't know enough to question you on that. So you could have
said
told me.
1824?
Sure did.
Actually, no, I think that's Monroe. I think that's the very end of the Monroe presidency. Now I got to look it up, though.
But yeah, 1824. The now famous fossil collector Mary Anning.
It was
Uh,
Monroe.
it was Monroe. Okay.
Yeah.
But yeah, Mary Anning, who nowadays is very widely recognized as a, you know, very skilled amateur paleontologist and fossil collector, in her time was not recognized by the public at all. Um, but she was noted for finding what she called bezoar stones in some of her fossils, mostly ichthyosaurs, which are a marine reptile that are very fish looking, but they're reptiles that were just so good at being in the water that they like re-evolved to look like fish, or
Hmm.
evolved convergently to look like fish, because that's just a good body shape to have when you're in the water.
Yep.
um, and so when I was doing some research for this episode, I was like, is a bezoar stone something that I'm supposed to just know what that is? Because I didn't know what it was. Um,
I certainly don't know what it is.
so a bezoar is essentially just like a ball of indigestible material in the stomach or digestive tract. So that's like if if you were to eat a bunch of like twigs and chew up a bunch of plant material like that, it would ball up because your stomach couldn't really digest it, and if you ate enough of it, it would clog up your digestive system. So it's just a ball of stuff that is not probably supposed to be there.
Hmm.
That happens sometimes throughout like medicinal history. Um, anything from like hair will do that if your digestive system is not set up to break down hair. Um, very famously, at least as a kid, I was always told don't swallow your bubble gum because it'll get
Yeah.
stuck.
I always heard it
Um,
would stay in your stomach for 7 years.
right. So it's like if you were to eat like a whole bunch of bubble gum, I don't know how true this is, but like according to 7-year-old Gavin's mind, that would essentially form a bezoar and get stuck in your stomach.
Which, to be clear, would be not good.
That yes, that would be very bad. And so Mary Anning, her idea was like, okay, so this is that from these ichthyosaurs that got turned into a stone when they became fossils. So she was not far off. She was
Right.
really close. Um, and so she noted that sometimes she would kind of crack these open, and that usually, especially for the ichthyosaurs, they would contain things like fish bones and scales, and sometimes even the bones of like other smaller ichthyosaurs. So she's like, okay, so it must be something that they were eating, but they just couldn't digest it. Maybe this is what killed them. Who knows? Um, and then in 1829, so 5 years later, William Buckland, who was a British paleontologist at the time and who very frequently, uh, went to Mary Anning for fossil specimens and things. And I want to say he was the only one to actually credit her in a publication.
Really?
I know she got credited once. I think it was by him. I'm pretty sure it was. Um, but yeah, so he was the first one to actually propose that these bezoar stones were actually fossilized poop, and he gave them the name coprolite, which literally means feces stone or poop stone.
Poop stone.
And then in the 1840s, so continuing to jump further ahead a little bit, people actually started mining coprolites in England because they're really high in phosphates. And, that's mostly just from being like concentrated. So it's like, especially for reptiles, they concentrate their poops a lot. Um,
What do you mean concentrate them?
So basically, they eat more than once per poop.
Okay, so they don't poop very often, is what you're saying.
Yeah, in general,
Okay,
especially ones with higher metabolisms, like ichthyosaurs probably had. Um,
gotcha.
but yeah, so they concentrate phosphates, especially predators, because phosphates are pretty common in plants, and so things or things that do photosynthesis in general. So things that eat those build up some more phosphate. Things that eat those things build up more and more phosphate. So it's a concept called bioaccumulation. That's why things like bald eagles get really threatened anytime that there is like a contamination in the river or lake or wherever they're hunting, because
Right.
they eat the things that are like third or fourth level up the food web. So they eat things that are already really concentrated in that toxic substance, or in this case, those phosphates. And so ichthyosaurs are the same way. They're pretty top predators. So they just concentrate a lot of these things, a lot of these different chemical compounds and different things like that. But phosphates make really good fertilizer because plants need them.
Right, yeah, that's, I feel like that's something that everybody kind of learns at some point is like, why does the farm smell like poop? Well, as it turns
Right.
out.
Yeah, exactly. So just like manure makes good fertilizer, apparently so do coprolites. And so people would mine them and grind them up and extract the phosphates from them and use them to make fertilizer.
Hmm.
And so that sort of declined a lot, probably around the 1880s. And it's really tragic that a lot of these coprolites were lost this way, because, like, I'm sure that there were unique ones that we haven't found, similar ones of since. Like, I'm positive that that's true, because
Right.
this was a pretty widespread thing. Um, and so yeah, around the 1880s, it kind of dwindled down, but then it actually picked back up. The mining did anyway, during World War
Right.
II, or World War One rather, because
Okay.
phosphates are also a pretty important part of making gunpowder.
Really?
Yeah, and
Oh,
so
jeez.
they were needed. They needed more phosphates for munitions for the war, and so it is very likely that during World War One, some German soldiers were killed with like poop bullets. Do with
Which
that
wouldn't be the worst
information
thing
what you
that
will.
World War One soldiers were killed with.
Well, yeah, that's true. Uh, we've all seen Wonder Woman. Um,
I have not.
oh, you really should. At least the first one. Don't watch Wonder Woman 1984. It's a bad movie. But the first
Okay.
one's really good. Uh,
Understood.
um, but yeah, so that is sort of a brief history of coprolites. And then since World War One, we've you know decided not to destroy them and to actually study them like the scientific resource that they are. Um, And yeah, so that's sort of, again, talking about sort of the marine realm. Ichthyosaurs are purely marine. They could not come up onto shore like at all. Their body just didn't allow it. So they absolutely can be, uh, found in marine environments. I don't. I'm actually going to look up if we've actually found any whale coprolites, because I don't know that we have, but it wouldn't surprise me if we did.
Hmm. And I certainly have, nothing to contribute there until you look it up.
Yeah, apparently we have. So there are some
Okay.
relatively recent ones from like the Pleistocene. I don't know how old they go. Whales are somewhat old. They were really really. I think when they first started getting pretty big in the water was like late Eocene, so probably around 30 or so million years ago. Um,
Right.
let's see. This is a really long article that I don't want to read live. So we do have whale. We do have whale coprolites, I guess. So again, I'm sure just like on land, they're pretty hit or miss whether they actually get preserved or not.
Hmm.
But I would imagine that ones from things like dolphins that tend to stick more toward the shore. I'm sure there are lots of like open water dolphins as well, but the dolphins that stick closer to shore, I would imagine that we probably don't have very many coprolites from them. But from bigger whale species, yeah, that I would say that they're not common, obviously, but they're not terribly
It's
uncommon based
possible,
on
right?
just my quick googling there. And then I want
As
to
long
end
as
off,
it's possible. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I want to end off this episode with my favorite example of a coprolite.
Oh, we haven't even done the favorite yet.
No, it was the
Oh my
T-Rex
gosh.
one, and then I
I was gonna
remembered
say.
this. I remembered this. I heard about this not too long after it happened. So this was from 2019, and this might technically be cheating because it's relatively recent, geologically speaking. Actually, it's very recent, geologically speaking. So there was a
I will
human
allow it.
coprolite, a human
Okay.
coprolite from that was found in Texas, and they carbon dated it to around 1500 years ago. So like in the AD times, and it had pretty much what you'd expect a poop to be composed of for being in that area. You know, it was in, I
Hmm.
believe, western Texas, so very deserty. So it had things like agave, prickly pear cactus, which is quite edible if you just like pluck off the spines, I guess. But also, it had essentially an entire rattlesnake,
What?
fangs and all,
From a human?
from a human.
Dude, that's metal right there.
It's very metal. And
That is
so
metal.
I believe, and there's a whole article to this that is linked on the Pooseum website. So it's,
The poo-
the Pooseum's website is literally just pooseum.com.
Please make sure that you put that in the our shared notes so I can link that in the
I sure
description.
will. And uh, on the Pooseum website, they link to an article in Smithsonian Magazine about this human coprolite.
Hmm.
And of course, I can't talk about an article without some minor criticisms. Uh, at several points, they refer to the snake fang because there was a real rattlesnake fang over a centimeter long. So, like, not huge. It was not like a gigantic snake. But a centimeter fang's not nothing.
No,
And so, especially
it'll do the job.
to be passing through you. Um, but yeah, they call the snake fang an incisor, which you probably know is the flat teeth at the front of your mouth.
Hmm. Yeah.
Snakes don't have incisors.
So
Incisors are very much a mammal thing
so that's
because
is that just an incorrect name then?
yes, that's them getting their terminology wrong.
Okay.
And there's a couple other things, but again, as with always on this podcast, I can't talk about other people writing popular science articles without critiquing them a little bit. Anywho,
Of course not.
but yeah, so this almost entire snake. Let me see. So there were 11 ribs, 11 vertebrae, 48 scales, and a fang. So it's like, granted, 11 vertebrae does not a snake make, but that's a very large portion of a snake.
I mean, that's way more of a snake than you should be eating, I think.
Yeah, and so they were able to determine from the scales that it was probably a western diamondback rattlesnake.
Hmm.
And yeah, so just in this whole coprolite, and so the authors gave a couple different perspectives on this. They said that it potentially might have been part of a ceremony or a ritual because justifiably, like, why else would somebody do that?
I I mean, could it be someone was so desperate? You said it was in the middle of the desert, did you?
Right, but it's they also um, had plant stuff, you know, in their coprolites as well. So it's like in particular areas, you know, edible plants are not terribly hard to come by.
Hmm.
So, granted, it is very hard, especially with humans, because humans do weird things. It's really hard to tell. So they said it might have been some kind of ceremonial or ritual thing, um, or potentially they might have just said like this person might have just been weird.
You can never discount that possibility.
Because they talk to some of the like Native American tribes with a history of being in the area,
Hmm.
and they all of them that they talked to were basically like, I mean, yeah, like historically, like our people have eaten snakes, but we usually cut off their heads and rattles and skin them first. So it's like the fang and the scales being there is they're like, no, like we would just
Right,
eat a
something's
whole
wrong
snake.
there.
Right. They're like, that's at least not part of our rituals.
Hmm.
Um, so might just be a weird guy. Might be some kind of cool archaeological, anthropological thing. Um, but man, I feel so bad for that guy. Like the next day,
Whenever that was coming out, I mean, fangs and ugh,
it was only one fang to
that's
be fair.
even still, that's one more fang than I ever want to poop out.
Absolutely. So, uh, yeah, that is coprolites.
That was oh, that was glorious. Everything about that was glorious. I got to make poop jokes and not feel bad about it. I have one more poop story actually from teaching.
Please.
So this was not this year. This goes back to when I was a substitute teacher.
Okay.
Probably 5 years ago now. I guess the
Mm-hmm.
2017 is when this would be. So 4 years ago. Um, and I was doing a half a day in the kindergarten class.
Oh no.
Yeah. And there's a reason they don't let me teach kindergarten. And so, I mean, they should let me in schools anyways, but there's a real
Oh
reason,
God.
And so we have recess. It's going well. Kids are all playing, having fun. This one adorable little girl comes up to me. Mr. B? I'm like, yeah. She goes, I pooped my pants. And I'm not qualified to deal with that situation.
As 5-year-olds are wont to do occasionally.
As it happens, I'm like, do you have an extra pair of clothes? And she's like, yeah. I'm like, okay, go to the nurse and they will deal with it because I'm certainly not.
Yeah.
So I didn't realize just how often poop was going to come up for me, and just in my own life. And I'm glad this episode was able to bring it out. This was almost a therapy session for me, to, a therapy session for me to get it out, which is just a great sentence that I just said given the context.
Better out than in, I always say.
This has been episode 45 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to poop. My name is Mike. That
Oh
is
my God.
Gavin. Oh, I can't wait to see what next week holds. Take care, everybody.